Welcome to the Viktor Frankl podcast. My name is Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch, licensed marriage and family therapist and author of a new book on Viktor Frankl called Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul. It's a pleasure to have with us today our guest, Dr. Yehuda Pryce, who's a psychotherapist, a doctor of social work, and somebody who has a remarkable story to tell us today. Dr. Pryce, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Rabbi.
Hey, Dr. Pryce, I had a chance to meet you at a conference last year in New York. I heard your incredible story. You're a doctor of social work. You have quite an interesting career. Before we get started with finding meaning and therapy and talking about Viktor Frankl, just give us a bit of a brief history about your own life. It's a remarkable story.
Well, thank you. Yes, it was great meeting you there and to see all the sort of from medical professionals out there, our therapists and whatnot. So I guess I don't have your typical background of a therapist, though many of us therapists do have a colorful background. My background started at me being raised. I am the product of two immigrants. My mother was raised Muslim in Sri Lanka. My dad came from Jamaica. I struggled for identity growing up. And I eventually found identity in what we would call street life, being a gangster, being embraced by gang members and all that the street culture entailed. And I found meaning, I found purpose, I found belonging, and that eventually led me to a life of crime when I was in and out of juvenile hall. And I eventually was sentenced to 24 years in prison for a robbery. Nobody's hurt. Don't say that to minimize it, but just to give context. 4 years for a robbery, 20 years in enhancements, and sentenced to 24 years. And inside prison, it was a harrowing journey. Prison is tough. Everything that you heard about it, the rumors are probably true, probably worse, because I'm not going to sit here and describe them all. But within the confines of prison, being what we called being buried alive, so to speak, I was able to find ultimate meaning and purpose after first rejecting religion altogether, rejecting my roots to Christianity, and eventually finding Judaism. I also met the woman who would become my wife on a contraband cell phone while I was in prison. And when I was released, which I was released early, actually, and so I only served just a little bit over 16 years in prison. When I was released in 2018, I subsequently entered into an Orthodox Garrist conversion program, completed my conversion in 2020. Also, when I got out of prison, the calling for social work was right before I got out of prison, meaning I was running these personal development, facilitating these groups and designing this curriculum for people incarcerated. And I recognized the sort of interconnecting sort of the commonality of trauma and not being able to process it, and ultimately searching for something. And I said, you know what, maybe my background might help and aid other people in getting through the sort of struggles that I did. And so when I got out, I finished my bachelor's in sociology with an emphasis in social welfare. I got my master's of social work degree from the University of Southern California, and then I completed my doctorate of social work from Simmons University, and eventually became a licensed clinical social worker. And I have helped in the context of helping people with high acuity mental health challenges who are chronically homeless. I have participated in a young adult court program helping people who transitional age youth, age 18 to 25, who become incarcerated and are transitioning out into the community. And also I provide individual psychotherapy to lifers in prison preparing for the parole board. And I'm a senior director helping design rehabilitative programming for people in prison. And the final thing, to end it all in describing everything on one foot, I also am a therapist at the Chabad Treatment Center in Los Angeles.
It's an incredible story. I just want to demystify for our audience some of the experiences that you had being incarcerated. I think it was Penguin Bay it was called. That's a pretty
Pelican Bay State Prison.
Excuse me,
yeah.
Pelican Bay, and that's a level 4 institution. That's a pretty serious place to be in.
Doesn't get a higher security than that in California as far as a general population.
And one of the things I remembered from your speech in New York last year was the seriousness of being in prison, the racial wars going on, the gang wars. I mean, your life was really under threat. Can you talk a bit about that, the threat that you experienced in jail?
Yeah, for a lot of people, they don't necessarily recognize the dynamics going inside prison. Everything is hyper racialized. So just based on what you present or look like, that will be the racial group that you have to identify with. And which that means is if there's any altercation between racial groups, it's incumbent on you to jump in and enjoy and join in into the violence for your racial team, because if you don't, your own racial group will attack you worse. So there's many nights there was skinheads sharpening knives next door to me, right? Where you have to prepare. Well, what am I going to do if they open up the cell door at the same time? We were on lockdown a lot, so instead of taking a 5 minute shower once every 3 days, a lot of times we sat on the toilet and poured water over our head. That was our bath. This is how we survived on a day to day. And it became to the point where violence and expecting violence to occur became very normalized. And it's kind of hard to truly conceptualize living in a state where there's this constant state of anxiety and dread, but also not being able to show it and also not necessarily being able to talk about it. For certain racial groups, you weren't allowed to see a therapist because they would consider you potentially snitching, is what we call it, cooperating with authorities. And for others, there's that stigma behind mental health that there's something you're weak. There's some weakness and something wrong with you. So don't turn to a professional. And on top of that, there's just the added of because these professionals are connected to authority figures and to a system that has oppressed them, legally oppressed by design. That's what prison is supposed to do. And it's hard to be able to create that therapeutic alliance. As you know, a lot of gains that we get partly depend on the therapeutic modality, but a lot of it is a therapeutic alliance, right? And when you're not able to form that inside prison, it just creates a recipe for
Yeah.
not healing.
It's all about designing alliance with your clients, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they must find you so interesting when you meet them because you walk the walk and talk the talk. You were there.
Yes.
Some guy
Yes.
like me talking to people, you were one of them, now you're out and trying to transform their lives. That must be quite remarkable.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Actually, one of the reasons I wanted to get into social work or clinical social work specifically is because I remember going into juvenile hall, juvenile jail, and I remember them trying to send me this brand new, freshly graduated social workers, and maybe they had all the requisite skills needed, but nonetheless, especially when you're young, you see yourself in other people, and I just said, you know what, there's no way these social workers can understand what's going through my head and what I'm and the environment that I have to navigate around. So I hope that my sort of lived experience kind of helps helps them to cross that bridge a lot easier.
But your lived experience is quite somewhat unremarkable than remarkable. And one of the videos I watched of you online, you talked about having a kind of average childhood. You mentioned you were lower middle class, just doing average in school. Something happened. I'm interested. Something happened to you. You talked about some otherness, perhaps, the racism you're growing up with, you were seeking out, and then joining a gang. The gangster life for you was a type of meaning, actually, in a funny way. It was sort of an empowerment. And then you move into jail, and then you find meanings. Let's go from that feeling of otherness to finding meaning in the gangster community and then finding meaning in jail.
Yeah, as you mentioned, this feeling of otherness, and I can imagine, as you can imagine, during your adolescence, your peers' opinions of you could be magnified out of proportion. So I don't want to act as if every every kid I encountered made me feel like this, but there was enough, and enough doesn't have to be a lot, but there's enough for me to think that their opinions were my entire world. But when I was 2 years old, my mother remarried. She divorced from my biological father, and she remarried. She married a white man. Now, that in itself shouldn't be an issue. But when I was young, I was dealt with people in my neighborhood who were white. They were teenagers. They were older than me. They specifically would bully me, chase me home, calling me the N-word in front of my family. And I really thought to myself, like, I wanted to be able to change whatever I could change about me that allowed me not to be discriminated or made to feel that way just for existing, right? It wasn't like I could just, if I studied hard or I did this or that, that would change it. People were saying just because who I am, and it was my skin color. And not only that, as a going through my adolescence, I also had black people say that I wasn't black enough because I had white siblings, from my stepfather, and I had a white stepfather, and again, this was my family. I couldn't change my family, so I just felt like, wow, like there's nothing I can do, and I just want to belong. I don't want to stand out. I just want to belong. And the gang members, and I don't want to just relegate it to gang members specifically. It was people who were participating in this criminal subculture that we could color outside the box of societal norms, and I could kind of create this identity for myself, identity created in, yeah, there's power, there's immediate power. It's not abstract. You're not telling a kid, work hard, do your homework, and even though your peers might not respond in the way you want, sometime in the future, after you graduate, go to college, graduate, get a career, do that, then you'll have this sort of sense of being, this empowerment, this identity that you want. That's super abstract to a kid. I got the power right then and there, fear, respect. People noticed me, and I had a mechanism to gain power, to gain being seen, and that was by committing more crime, being as tough as I could possibly be. And to me, that was a ticket into to finally feeling good about myself, even though obviously this was an unhealthy way to find purpose and meaning.
And it got pretty heavy. You got into some legal trouble. You were sentenced to 24 years in the prison. That's pretty.
Yes, and to say, just to really highlight it, right? I was going in and out of juvenile hall for narcotic sales, for possession of deadly weapons, for gang activities. And then I get caught. Well, I talk about this 24-year sentence. There's a little bit more of that to fully know, like how far down this road, this path. Judaism will say off the derrick, but I was on the derrick for criminality. Is that I was arrested. My main charge was for this robbery. But when they arrested me, when they did this raid, they caught me with a mini Uzi, a loaded 45 caliber pistol with three extra clips, ski mask, and walkie-talkie. I bailed out and was arrested after dedicating myself to commit a drug robbery every week. I was arrested in a gang territory with another loaded pistol, a holster in my waist, a sawed-off shotgun, and a gang member in the passenger seat. I bailed out. This is California. The laws are a little bit different. I bailed out and was arrested the next day. In a task force raid with narcotics and over 500 rounds of ammunition. And then I bailed out again and was arrested for witness intimidation of my gang member co-defendant. So I was all in because I had purpose, I had meaning, and I was committed to anything that would allow me to further entrench myself in this particular identity.
So you find yourself in jail. It's a difficult place to be, but many people in the same situation you're in wouldn't end up where you're at today. What is it about you uniquely? I want to go really deep with you. What is it about you uniquely that you were able to pick yourself up in that situation and find meaning?
Yeah,
Where did that come
great
from?
questions.
Yeah.
I've asked myself during the process, right? Because I think part of a coping mechanism that I developed was a sort of disassociation where I was able to, yes, I understand I'm in this horrible place, but I am not fully, maybe I'm not fully processing all the emotions connected to this. So much so that I remember telling my family to stop visiting me. And it was because, yes, you gain strength from seeing and being connected to family members, but I was in this dark, dark environment where I didn't necessarily need to rely on the best version of myself or my higher aspirations. I needed to be able to do whatever I needed to do to survive and have no compunctions about it. And so them coming could kind of mess with my head in that I see this sunshine, I'm embraced with what could possibly be, and then they leave. They strip search us naked before we go back, and then we're back in the dungeon, right? And so messing that kind of messed with my head. So I kind of told them to stop visiting me. Let me just be fully immersed in this environment. Uh, and that's just what it was. But not only that, I think I realized that if I claimed to be a gangster, that there was a couple possibilities to fully actualize that identity. One was to spend a lot of time in prison, which I was doing, or to die living this lifestyle, which I at least was putting myself in a position to do so. So so about when it comes to me, I'm less concerned about consequences. I'm more concerned about being authentic. In my sort of subculture, we call it keeping it real. I was concerned about keeping it real, and it was keeping it real to whatever ethos, whatever identity that you profess to have, regardless of the consequences. So at that time, even though it was applied to something negative, uh, it allowed me to deal with the reality that I was living that really broke down a lot of people. But it also it also provided me direction towards if I could apply this, right, this
Yeah,
commitment,
that's right.
right, towards a positive coping mechanism, right, a
And
positive
that's right.
identity.
If you could find that spark, you keep on that spark within, utilize the spark. But
Yeah.
what made it go in the positive direction is my question. What did you see?
So there was a confluence of things. There's a multiple things that happen around the same time. So I'll name three of them. If you're able to draw any insights from the outside, I'm always open to it. It's like I don't know if you play chess, but sometimes when I play chess, I don't think of the greatest moves as I'm playing it, but if I'm watching somebody from the side doing it, I can more objectively observe the patterns and the movements needed. So perhaps you can do the same. But so there are three things. One of them was my younger sister writing me a poignant letter that really impacted me. That she said, this is when I was in Pelican Bay. She essentially said that I love you and I'm going to support you through your entire time incarcerated, right? Which was great. That was what I needed. But
Unconditional acceptance.
unconditional acceptance, right? I mean, obviously, there's a fine line between enabling and that, but without the unconditional acceptance, I don't know if I would have been properly prepared or feel, I guess, or feel the ability to do that without having that sort of constant support system with me. Because when you don't have that sort of positive affirmations and all the things that will support you to do that, maybe your brain is it's not even going to go down that route. It's not possible. I can't do it. But I knew it was possible. But so she told me that she fully accept me and will fully support me, but that she's mad at me. She's mad that because of my actions and my choices, I will not be there uh, when she graduates high school, when she graduates college, when she gets married, when she has kids, when she's in her career. And it was because of my decisions. And not only that, like because of my actions, as you can imagine, it's not just me in a vacuum. It affected my whole family. And so my mother suffered depression. It caused strife and more conflict around the house. And that was me who did that through my choices. Obviously, I wasn't mature. My prefrontal cortex hadn't fully developed. I don't use that as an excuse, right? But I didn't fully process that in a way. And I think the only way I was able to fully process that and it was fully able to hit home was me to be kind of isolated in the way I was, which was in prison and kind of kept from the marijuana, the alcohol use, the constantly distracting myself with criminal exploits and these friends. I was just meant to deal with that sort of reality and it's in that quiet. And then also, I remember being in administrative segregation. So we have Pelican Bay State Prison, general pop, maximum security. And then if you mess up there, right, you can go to what we call administrative segregation, which is the whole, which is complete solitary confinement. And I remember being in there. I wasn't in there for a long time, but I remember being in there for conspiracy to assault a correctional officer and me realizing, like, you know what? I'm gonna be doing a lot of this while I'm in prison. I'm gonna but I'm okay with that because this is a consequence of who I am and me living my authentic self is what I call it. Obviously, I know this is not my authentic self now, but then I said I'm a gangster. This is what it's going to be, and I'm gonna spend a majority of my life on solitary confinement in the hole in administrative segregation. But it's okay. But then I had to take the next step, right? But what am I doing it for? I'm okay with the consequences, but what am I doing it for? And ultimately, I had to realize I wasn't doing it for a good reason. I was doing it more than anything. A lot of my actions were connected to insecurity, were connected to wanting to be seen, wanting to belong, and to do all this negative stuff and negatively affect the people, the few people who would support me, which were my family, and a certain amount of friends. I neglected all that to chase shadows. So I had to recognize that this wasn't an ultimate purpose. It wasn't a good purpose, even though I could accept the consequences. And finally, I would say I just kind of looked around after a while, and I noticed gang members taking pride in their identity of what they were doing and who they were, and blaming other people, blaming the system, blaming law enforcement. And to me, that didn't seem, one, it didn't seem empowering. You're taking away your agency and our choice in the matter. It didn't seem logical. It didn't seem real. What they were doing was the right thing to do. And I started to say, like, no, the way we're living our lives, to be frank, I thought we were losers. I thought we were living a life. We're begging people. We're grown men begging for soups because we've made decisions in our lives that had us in prison, and yet we were pretending like we had pride. So this kind of set the stage where I said there has to be something more. Though I should add, Rabbi, that I was adamant that I was going to do it without religion.
That's the position you took at that time. You're going to do it without God.
Yes, because I try to look into God because that's what the stereotype is. That's what we do in prison. We look into religion and we get religious for the stay, so to speak, and then you get out and you get back to living your life, however you live it. And I studied Christianity, and I quickly surmised that it wasn't for me, but because this was my cultural background, a lot of times when our cultural background gets undermined, we throw it, we just say, no, none of this works, right? And so I felt like, and I'm gonna quote somebody here, not because I'm a fan, but because I feel like that message is what I resonated back then. But I felt like religion was the opium for the masses, and it was something that weak people needed to do just to get through life. And I was agnostic. I wasn't atheist, right? Because I think that's a leap of faith as well. It's a cynical leap of faith, but it's a leap of faith as well. But I was agnostic. So for all practical purposes, I didn't subscribe to any particular religious philosophy or religion or anything like that. And but I was gonna better myself. I just didn't know what it looked like.
But then you met a rabbi, or you were invited to a service. What happened next?
Yeah, yeah. So I was known as the guy that would challenge anybody's religious beliefs based on whatever theological framework they operated from. So if you claim to be Christian, I would argue with you on that. Whatever denomination, Muslim, I've read the Quran front to back, and I never consciously met a Jew. Like I didn't know. I never knew consciously met a Jew. And when I heard they hired a rabbi, I'm like, oh, this is great. This gives me an opportunity to argue with a Jew, not only just a Jew, a rabbi, right? And if I undermine his faith, and I felt like I was a great arguer, that I would undermine other religious faiths that kind of took Judaism and went their own separate way with it. And so I thought this was going to be a great argument for me to win. And I went to this rabbi, and the rabbi, I could give you the short summary of it. The rabbi won the argument. But essentially, I'll give you one of the main things that I really took away from that meeting with the rabbi. One, he wasn't trying to convince me. He said, "Look, you don't have to be a Jew; just be a good person." Now I know there's some rules related to be a good person, but nonetheless, I didn't have to be a Jew, right? And to me, that was like I was like, wow, right? That is so sensible, right? Why do I have to be a Jew? Why can't I just be a good person? And Judaism said, "Hey, yeah, yeah, we've already thought about that, right? Don't worry about it. Just be a good person." So I thought that was just mind blowing. So that intrigued me. But also when I was trying to dissuade the rabbi from believing what he believed, in all of my hubris, he essentially said that if you look throughout history, Judaism has worked for the Jewish people. And I'll unpack that a little bit because he would introduce me to a book or two, like almost every, like he would he introduced me to a book every day or two, because I was really hungry to read, recognizing this lacuna, this gap in my sort of understanding of Judaism, because I only heard about the Jewish people through the lens of other peoples, not through the Jewish people, through non-Jews. So I knew I needed to learn before I could argue. So I learned to argue. Maybe that was at least my initial motivation. But thinking back to Judaism as work with the Jewish people, I really took in I thought about it. I thought about the Jewish people being this small minority of people, right? That uh, their identity was formed based on their perception and relationship with God, with the source of all being, with the force that animates all of existence, Har Sinai, the revelation, and through that, right, which literally formed Jewish identity. Afterwards, Jews spread this idea of God to the world that fundamentally changed the world, changed how so many people relate to God, especially if we think about the billions of people who kind of took from Judaism to establish whatever sort of religious religion they did. But culture in general, like how we relate to God instead of the gods, lowercase g, as the world was operating before. And the Jewish people were persecuted for thousands of years, but managed to maintain their religion, culture, language, identity, family structures, communal structures. And I thought about, like, wow, this small minority people, all they're doing, right, is bringing God and morality to the world, and the world is persecuting them. And I'm seeing that, and I started really thinking about it, and I finally concluded, right? And I'm giving you ex post facto logical sort of reason, but what I think I intuited, right? Like I just felt drawn to, but I felt like the Jewish people are proof that God exists. And I wanted to have a relationship with this God of the Jews, so to speak, God of the world, but God as the Jews came to know him. And that was like really the motivation.
And could I just add to that if I can for a moment? Is it possible that you saw yourself as being persecuted by society, by things around you that you lost control of? And in spite of that, you were able to be who you want to be, to pick a higher identity?
That's a good take. That's a good take. As with many good takes in therapy, whether we consciously recognize it at the time or not, right? It could definitely be playing a part. I wondered this, right? Because I struggled so long for identity. I finally essentially gave my life to establish this new identity. So I'm finally secure in identity and belonging. And it's then, and I felt too, you know what? If anybody could handle prison, it's somebody like me. So because I am able to disconnect and still not feel so down on myself, and that's why I felt like I could do it without religion. Uh, but then I put my identity in jeopardy. I deliberately, this wasn't a Jewish community for me to connect with. This was me saying, I'm not connecting with anybody. I'm pulling back. I'm connecting with God. Maybe I'll connect with the Jewish community at some point in time, but this is between me and God. And I would just say that it was rough because I knew that I wasn't Jewish, right? So it wasn't even me establishing an identity as a Jew, right? I was in this weird place where I wasn't in an official conversion program because I wasn't in an official community, and I was imprisoned by myself and people telling me that they won't accept you when you get out of prison. And I'm like, they very may be right, and not because of racism, because I'm black or anything like that, but because I spent the majority of my life in prison, right? And that's a resume of sorts for people to judge me on, right? And so if anything, it threw my identity more into question, right? I think the difference is it was a purpose and an identity, not motivated by insecurity, not motivated by a necessarily a need to belong, but motivated by me feeling like I discovered emis, like I discovered truth. And since
Truthfulness.
ultimate truth connected to purpose and meaning in a way that nothing else could, that I felt like I just needed to be connected to that. And so immediately I didn't belong more. I felt more, I stood out more. I couldn't eat with people. I'm keeping kosher, right? I'm doing like on Shabbos, my nickname was Shabbat. I didn't call me that. They call me that because they knew I'm dressing in my best clothes for Shabbat. And I'm just sitting on my bunk all day, just learning because that's all I could do. I didn't have a community. So so it gave me an identity and a purpose and meaning, and it helped me stand out more. That it did, but I think my personality trait of being able to be committed and not care about the consequences played a significant
When
part in
you
me.
when you saw the truth, so to speak, you're willing to commit yourself in spite of what you were going through.
In spite, because I felt this was the ultimate truth. This was ultimate meaning, and I've been so disconnected from ultimate meaning that I'm willing to sacrifice and do whatever it takes to connect with this ultimate meaning.
I want to play for you a little clip from Viktor Frankl. We can reflect in a moment about it. It's quite remarkable. He's speaking in probably late 70s, early 80s about finding meaning in difficult times. Let's kind of listen to him and see what he has to say. I think this itself will be quite a remarkable revelation, his video. Let me just put it
Okay.
up here and we'll take a listen to it. Here it is. Very quick, very briefly.
What is the difference between people who are able to pick themselves up, get over life's problems, and those who are not?
The decisive factor is decision, the freedom of choice, the freedom to come up with a decision. It should be, I would like to become this way or another, in spite of conditions that should only seem to fully determine my behavior. I wish to act freely as a responsible being, which is a human being. I wish to act in accord with heredity and environment, owing what I become to them, but also, if need be, in spite of the worst conditions. This is exactly what you could watch and witness under severe, extreme conditions of stress, or of tragic conditions. Just think of people living for several years under the worst conditions of a prisoner of war camp. There's a whole body of psychiatric literature about that, or for that matter, in concentration camps. And this is what should be acknowledged. People are free, and if you watch or study the lives of such people in just a detached, down-to-earth, strictly empirical, scientific way and fashion, in another way than you presented it and you commented it, in another way, then people get the picture, the impression of a human being as something, not someone, something that is fully determined. Whereas they don't recognize and acknowledge the freedom and the responsibility for themselves, the responsibility for making something or someone out of himself.
I think that's something you did, wasn't it? In spite of these worst circumstances, he himself was in several concentration camps, Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. He was a psychiatrist who believed that you could find meaning in the worst of circumstances. I think your life, maybe not as bad as Auschwitz, but on the way, incarceration, you were put in solitary confinement at times, temporarily. This is horrific for you. Yet you were able to pick yourself up and find meaning in spite of your environment. How did you do that? It's quite remarkable.
Thank you for playing that clip. I actually remember reading his book prior to me having any introduction to anybody Jewish or Judaism, just on the sort of psychological aspect of it. I picked it up, Man's Search for Meaning, and it was like, as wow, it resonated a lot. He mentioned about making decisions and having the choice. I did feel that in prison, all I can control were my specific choices, right? My choices of how I decided to do my own program inside of my prison cell. And I remember so many people, when I spoke to them, acted as if they couldn't do anything right now because they're incarcerated, and they were planning to make all the big changes once they were released from prison. And I was like, no, your life is right now. Your life is when the good times, the bad times. I couldn't look at some sort of place somewhere in the world where people are struggling just to survive and say that their lives are less valuable, right? I had to make the decision: is my life valuable in there? And then actually make the choice to do something about it. And so, before you could find out what the ultimate meaning is, you have to at least come to the conclusion that your life itself has meaning. Then you might seek to define what that meaning is, but you kind of have to arrive. Like, and so I was in prison. I felt like my life has meaning. I don't know what it is. I have no idea whatsoever. I don't want it to be connected to religion, but then religion, specifically Yiddishkeit, Judaism, brought that towards me. One of the rabbis in prison told me that Judaism is about behavioral modification. And so to me, everything I was doing, the rituals, the literature, everything I was connecting to God, right, was about me changing myself, renovating myself, right? Teshuvah. We believe in that, not as a gift from Hashem, as a gift from God, but also like think of what that makes people feel about themselves when they know that I may have not made the best choices in my life, but there is redemption, there is a better way forward, and my sins can become merits, right? My poor mistakes can become merits. That is such a motivating and powerful force. And I felt in prison that there is this religion, there is this culture that believes in a concept that who I am right now in prison is not the end of the story, and I can improve. And I pursued it, and I pursued it, and I got an identity, and I got meaning that just fundamentally, this didn't change my life. That's the thing about meaning and purpose. It doesn't just change your life. The people who are in the vicinity of your life, connected to you, meaning and purpose lifts so many other people and affects so many other people. That's how I made it. And Judaism is the ultimate meaning because it's connected to the ultimate reality, which is God.
And they talk about the 12th step in AA is once you've done your own tshuva, done your own internal work, and have recovered from your addiction, you then take it out to other people. I want to talk about that for a moment. You switch from fixing yourself, finding meaning and purpose, and then helping other people. What was that like, the transition towards helping others? You had to go back to school, you had to become a social worker, you did your doctorate. And talk about that process. You went through school, now you're going out there and helping people. What was that like for you now, all that personal experience? What did it mean for you helping other people?
Yeah, great question. I would say first, as I started embarking on the professional side of things, I felt imposter syndrome, right? I felt like, am I the person capable of it? I haven't even worked out on my own stuff, right? I'm this, we're all works in progress. They say therapists should see therapists, right? We're all works in progress. But it became so empowering. And that's probably with the 12 steps, right? About being of service and connecting to it. One, it connects you to your roots of this struggle. And so you don't forget, right? And not only do you not forget, you don't forget in a healthy way. There's unhealthy ways not to forget. There's healthy ways to remember. And it's actually been a part of a healing process that continually reminds me of the things in the areas that I did work on. And not only that, I see myself in others, and I believe others see themselves in me. I work with clients from diverse backgrounds, Jews, non-Jews, Jews struggling with religion, with their identity, with things in the past. And there's a commonality. When people have purpose, right, they move through their treatment, they move through recovery in a fundamentally more effective way. I see it all the time. And sometimes I wish, right, because having purpose and meaning is not just an easy thing that you switch on. I wish that they can save so many years of even talk therapy or anything of that if they could just find the purpose and meaning. That's what did it for me. It wasn't years and years of talk
It wasn't
therapy.
years of psychotherapy in a prison where it wasn't okay to go to psychotherapy. You decided to fulfill a meaning. That was the transformation.
That's what did it. That's what did it when other things couldn't, right? Other things couldn't. It was that meaning that did it, and purpose.
This is exactly what Frankl said. Just last little part of his lecture, he was speaking to a group of college students, and listen to the
You
part.
really can be So we have to be idealists in a way, because then we'll wind up as the real realists. And you know who has said this? If we take man as he is, we make him worse. But if we take man as he should be, we make him capable of becoming what he can be. This was not my flight instructor, this was not me, this was Goethe. He said this verbally. And now you will understand why I, in one of my writings, once said, this is the most apt maxim and motto for any psychotherapeutic activity. So if you don't recognize a young man's will to meaning, man's search for meaning, you make him worse, you make him dull, you make him frustrated, you still add and contribute to his frustration. While if you presuppose in this man, even in this so-called criminal or juvenile delinquent or drug abuse and so forth, there must be a what we call spark, a spark of search for meaning. Let's recognize this, let's presuppose it, and then you will elicit it from him, and you will make him become what he in principle is capable of becoming.
So I want to share with you what that means for me as a psychotherapist, having written this book and teaching logotherapy, doing logotherapy, the therapy of meaning with my clients. I approach my clients as little gems. I'm always seeking out that little spark, that spiritual spark, the meaningful spark. Now, you and I know as psychotherapists, we could choose to go where we want to go with our clients, correct? We can go this way, we can go that way. We can go negative, we can go positive. We can go towards their childhood and spend the entire time in their childhood. We could go towards their present and the future. I found as a psychotherapist trained in trauma, CBT, psychoanalysis, going back to people's past, not as rewarding as when I started switching towards people's positive points and finding meaning. Are you finding the same thing when you do work with people today, being de-incarcerated?
Yeah. And I think I think this goes to my overall me dealing with like smart decarceration. And what happens is in America, in our incarceration system, a lot of it is based on an R&R model, which is risk, needs, responsivity, meaning you look at people who have had an encounter, the criminal justice system, and you only look for treatment in terms of what are the risk factors to commit new crime, and that's all you're caring about. Well, maybe we need to deal with housing, maybe we need to deal with jobs. Yeah, that's stuff to deal with, right? But that has nothing to do with purpose and meaning, right? And now we've shifted, recognizing that people could be so much more if you believe that they're not simply a risk, right? And we're just going to manage this risk, right? If you believe, like, look at people have hopes, wants, aspirations, and sometimes people, especially people who've been marginalized or come from really struggling communities, right? They may never had anybody believe in them for them to even know that they can believe in themselves and that their future is not simply of them not trying to get into trouble, but what they can possibly become. And as a psychotherapist, you know, too, for a lot of people, right, sometimes hyper focusing on previous traumas is not a beneficial thing, right? It can cause more problems than good. Don't get me wrong. I have no problem going back to childhood. I target memories. I do EMDR. It could be great, and there is a place for that. I imagine when you're even dealing with meaning and purpose, I imagine you do other sort of modalities alongside that. It's not restricted to that, but I could imagine that you've noticed that if a person has a why, this is probably me quoting from Viktor Frankl somewhere.
That's what you're meeting. Yeah.
Yeah. We could withstand anything. And when I heard that, this is before religion, this is before anything, it struck me as just a universal truth, right? Because I knew my life. I was just looking for meaning. If somebody could have helped me foster that, I wouldn't have been to prison. That's like the number one thing I know, that I wouldn't have been there. And there's so many other people. We got to start believing in people. I think it's more than it's about believing in people. And in order to believe in people, we could invest in meaning and purpose as they define it, not as we feel we should define it for them.
So if there's anybody listening to this podcast who themselves is getting involved with crime and with drugs, either becoming a gangster, who knows, what's your advice for them based upon your life experience and this discussion we had today about finding meaning?
Good question. I always wonder what would I have told myself back in the day, because I know I was stubborn and hard-headed. So with that in mind, knowing that I might be speaking to people who are stubborn and hard-headed like myself, I think having a honest heshbon nefesh, right? Having really a heshbon where you're really analyzing, why do you do the things you want to do, right? Why do you pursue your desires? And I realized for myself, a lot of it was connected to insecurities. A lot of it was connected to me resisting being responsible or recognizing that I had choice and agency, right? I felt very uncomfortable with that just based on my my upbringing. But to recognize that there's so much you can get out of life and be in life and impact others if you try to make the choices that you feel, right? That you feel based on what's possible, what's meaningful to you. When we talk about jobs, we don't talk about getting a person a job. We talk about meaningful work trajectories, something that you really connect with. And it might be something outside the box legally, right? Might be something outside of the box, right? But that's totally okay, because that might be where you're finding your meaning and your purpose from. And ultimately, you do not want to make some of the life decisions, the personality or decisions at a young age that can impact your formative years, your adult years, and where you're playing catch up. I'm playing catch up, right? Baruch Hashem, I'm married with four children now. It's what's possible, right? For a person that was a dedicated gangster, whole body tattooed up, Pelican Bay State Prison, dedicated to crime. But what's possible if you find meaning and purpose, the sky is the limit. And I'm telling you, not just by my own personal example, but from countless other individuals that I've had the blessing of being able to interact as they go through this change process. You just have to imagine and be open into imagining something that's better.
Dr. Yehuda Pryce, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to bring you back in the future.
I hope to be back. Thank you for having me, Rabbi.